We've spent a lot of time this season investigating the current marriage panic. And here are some of the things we found. A lot of people are concerned over how families, how people are doing these days. Some of that is legitimate. There's a lot of evidence that Americans are not doing so great. Loneliness has spiked. Rates of anxiety and depression have spiked. We're seeing a rise in what scientists call deaths of despair, suicides, overdoses. So, of course, people are trying to find solutions. One contingent thinks more marriage is, at least partially, the answer. Because at the same time, we are continuing to see changing patterns in relationships and family structures. People are marrying later and less often. Greater numbers of adults are living alone. This pro-marriage crew is sounding alarm bells that if we don't start marrying and quit divorcing, things will only get worse. So they're taking steps to encourage more marriage, reward people for coupling up, teach kids that marriage is a prereq for the American dream, make divorce more difficult. But our theory on this show is that the solution is actually the opposite. We think a world where people are either pushed to marry or punished for being single seems kind of miserable and is definitely not the path to stability or happiness. Unfortunately, we don't really have a way to test this theory. But what if we did? What if we could look beyond our shores at a country that was taking a very different approach? A country where marriage promoters are scarce, social safety nets abound, and contentment is a given. I'm Julie Kohler, and this is White Picket Fence. This episode, we're visiting Denmark, one of the countries that consistently, year after year after year, has some of the happiest citizens in the world. And we're taking a look at Danish culture around marriage and divorce and relationships and family to see if we can learn some secrets from the experts.
My name is probably pronounced Christian Bjørnskov. I'm sorry about that. I did my PhD thesis on the economics of social trust. And while I was doing that, realized that must have something to do with happiness. And it's just kept me interested since then. So what contributes to happiness? In particular, why is my country one of the happiest places in the world?
Christian is a leading happiness researcher and a member of the Happiness Research Institute's advisory board. So I thought a good place to start with a Danish happiness researcher would be, the basics.
Well, how do you define happiness?
Well, I prefer not to define happiness.
That was a surprise. So then, how do they measure happiness? Christian says that rather than defining what they're looking for and then looking for that definition, they just ask,
so how satisfied are you with your life these days?
What happens then is that the researchers get answers based on people's own definition of what actually matters to them.
And then after that, we can see what's common to those who are really happy, what's common to those who are not happy. And that way we kind of figure out what's common to ordinary people's definition of happiness.
As someone coming from the US and someone doing a podcast about marriage policies, I was obviously expecting marital status to factor into personal happiness in one way or another. But when I asked Christian about the central thesis of the pro-marriage movement, the answer he gave was a bit more complicated.
Does marriage make people happier?
Well, it's a tricky question because if you just look at married people, they are happier than the rest, and by quite a bit.
But there's a catch.
We have these surveys where we ask the same people every year. We can see life events. And in those kinds of studies, we can see what happens when people get married. And that gives them a little happiness boost, but it doesn't last.
What Christian and other researchers have found is that if you actually follow people throughout their lives, marriage provides a kind of happiness blip, a little boost, maybe for a year or two, but that's kind of it. Marriage is not a door that unhappy people walk through and find themselves in a permanent state of bliss. And similarly, when it comes to divorce
is a bad thing for your happiness. However, it probably doesn't last.
Turns out, it's the same as with marriage. Look at one moment in a divorced person's life, especially in the immediate aftermath, and they're unhappy. But look at a person's life writ large, and that decline in unhappiness is often a temporary dip. But more importantly, what the happiness research tells us is that neither marriage nor divorce are the primary factors of happiness, on paper at least. So then, what is?
And what actually makes them happier in the long run, permanently, is finding the right partner, regardless of whether you're married or not. That event is the most important one we can see in people's lives when we look at their happiness.
But even more predictive than any relationship status are some larger social elements. The first one, not very surprising.
Well, if you look at societies, the first thing is a very, very obvious thing. So rich, democratic, well-functioning, peaceful societies are happier than poor, autocratic, violent societies. So all what we would say the Western countries are happier than the rest of the world, simply because we're rich and because we have fairly decent institutions.
So the U.S. does have fairly decent democratic institutions, even if they have come under attack in recent years. And we are the 9th richest country in the world. We're richer than Norway, and Denmark, and Sweden, and Finland. But the U.S. is not even in the top 20 countries when it comes to happiness. The Nordic countries have been at the top of the list for decades. So what gives?
The extra contributing factor there is probably two things. The first one is social trust. That's the trust you can have in people you meet for the first time, the man in the street. So if you ask people, that's where we usually do it. In general, do you think most people can be trusted, or do you have to be careful? The world average is about 27-28% who say you can trust people. In Denmark and Norway, it's 70%.
Wow.
And one of the really, really interesting things is that those differences are actually mirrored across the US. So where the Scandinavians went in the late 19th century are where the most trusting Americans are today. That's North Dakota, which has a trust level that is basically the same as Sweden.
Well, that's fascinating. And it's probably no coincidence that I'm kind of hosting this podcast. I grew up in Minnesota myself and was, even though I'm not Scandinavian by ancestry, I'm like the one non-Scandinavian in Minnesota. But it definitely felt, I remember when I started traveling to Nordic countries, I was like, oh, this feels very familiar. And I think part of that is sort of that legacy of the social trust. That's really fascinating.
There are plenty of things that we don't have to worry about because we don't see other people as threats.
This idea, social trust, might seem kind of simple, but it actually has huge effects. Walk through any Nordic neighborhood and you'll see a row of strollers on the sidewalk outside coffee shops, with sleeping babies still inside. No one bats an eye. That social trust, also means citizens believe that their government is acting in their best interest. It means that the government believes that its citizens will maintain the social fabric of their country. And it means that people believe others will do the right thing. Your actions are part of a collective effort. In practice, this trust looks like Denmark's universal welfare model. It's based in the belief that all citizens have the right to fundamental benefits because they're citizens. The average Dane pays 46% of their income in taxes, but nearly 90% of them are happy to pay. They trust that their money is being used for the common good. This trust also plays a role in the other thing that makes Nordic countries the happiest.
It's a sense of personal freedom, that you both can change your own life and choose your own life, and you can do that without legal restraint, of course, but also without picking life choices that other people will think are taboo. So we think it's our right to choose our own life.
They trust people to make decisions about their own lives. They trust that people know themselves best. And while it was great hearing all about how amazing Denmark is, I had to ask,
what are you seeing in terms of happiness levels in the United States? I mean, I've certainly read the headlines about kind of decreasing happiness here in the United States. And it seems like in general, we're kind of a country a little bit obsessed with happiness, like all the things that are going to make us, have a happy life.
The US is not doing that bad. But happiness, some studies show in particular among women in the US, has been declining for some years. And we don't know exactly why it is. But we do see that happening.
That's really interesting. Do you have hypotheses?
Well, one thing is that for a Northern European like me, the US is sometimes very, very conservative. Not in a political sense, but in a social sense. You have these places that are extremely religious. And that kind of restrains some people's ability to make life choices that suit them.
Now, I think it's important to note here that religiosity in the U.S. has actually declined pretty significantly. But the religious right continues to play an outsized role in our politics. And the result is that Americans, especially women, are having our rights curtailed, our personal autonomy attacked. And that, obviously, decreases happiness. What's actually behind happiness is freedom, economic stability, democracy, legal systems that people believe in, cultures of trust. All of these are huge factors. The existence of these factors enables people to choose the type of lives they want to lead. So, for example, the choice to get married, to get divorced, to have kids before being married, to have them after, to not have them at all. Here is where we can really learn something from Denmark. We can learn what marriage looks like in a country that trusts its citizens.
I can say for sure that in Denmark, personal freedom and equality within relationships are highly valued and manifested in various aspects of our daily life.
That's Iben Sendil, a marriage and family therapist.
And marriage is seen as a deeply personal choice here, reflecting the broader societal priority on individual autonomy.
She's also the author of the best-selling book, The Danish Way of Parenting. And like in the U.S., conversations around marriage are often intertwined with conversations about building families.
And I firmly believe that Denmark's approach to parenting plays a significant role in why it has been voted the happiest country for over 40 years, now as number 2. But anyway.
Really slipping, yes.
Yeah.
In our first episode, we talked about the success sequence, the 3 steps that certain pundits claim will lead you straight to the American dream. Get a job, get married, have kids. In that order, and that order only. To have kids outside the sequence introduces them to a life of hardship. Because marriage isn't just for adults. It's supposed to create more well-off kids, too. So I asked Iben what the typical path in Denmark was. In a country where marriage isn't compulsory.
It is not uncommon for Danish couples to cohabit for many years before deciding to get married, or to choose to remain unmarried altogether as well. And this flexibility allows couples to navigate their relationships and create families in a way that feels authentic and meaningful to them without feeling constrained by traditional norms or expectations. It's not about you have to get married and then you get children. I mean, we say that in Denmark there are 37 ways of having a family.
Mm-hmm. I love that idea, that there are 37 ways of having a family.
I think that couples here typically see marriage as a way to formalize their commitment to each other and to confirm a bond, rather than viewing it as a necessity for societal approval or validation. And because it is a personal choice rather than an obligation here, we have the freedom as well to define our relationships on our own terms and create unions that are meaningful and authentic to us.
This idea of authenticity and individual autonomy is supported by a number of other factors: economic and political stability, social trust, a strong social safety net, and gendered roles in society are much less emphasized. In Denmark, both parents often work. Fewer than 1 in 10 couples have a father who works more than 40 hours and a mother who does unpaid labor. Essentially, less than 10% of families have a male breadwinner.
It's fine that you can have a partner that can bring out the best in you. Absolutely. But you don't have to marry for that. I mean, I don't know what happiness is for you in America, the idea of happiness. So you do A, B, C, D, E, and then you get married, and then you are happy. But that's, I mean, it sounds like a fairy tale somehow, you know.
And when marriage is treated so matter-of-factly, so is divorce. Iben, for example, has been married for 25 years. But her own parents were divorced, and that was fine too.
It's just easy to do. I think you can just do it online, actually. But I do think that we are not afraid to talk about it in Denmark. We are very open and honest, and it's not a bad thing, and it's not a shameful thing. I mean, it's just part of life. So we are very much pragmatic about it, kind of, because we don't enter into marriages because of a formula or something like that. I mean, there's so many ways to live. I mean, and having a family and being on your own, or not having a partner and having whatever you want.
Divorce is just a part of life, one that can involve sadness. It's a dissolution of a relationship, after all. But it's not a failure. To someone like Iben, the idea of marriage being a fix-all, a formula for happiness, that's just a fairy tale. But I'm going to be honest. A country where marriage is a choice and divorce is just an online form, to someone like me, an American family scientist, that sounds like the real fairy tale. So I wanted to talk with someone with a foot in each world, an American in Denmark who happens to be in the process of getting a divorce. For the sake of her privacy, we're going to call her Abby.
So maybe I'm not a very typical American woman. I never dreamed about my wedding day when I was a little girl and things like that. I didn't care about an engagement ring, but I always knew that I wanted to have a long-term partner and have kids.
Abby's soon-to-be ex-husband is Danish, and they met while living in the U.S. At first, marriage wasn't on the table. Her ex thought marriage was overrated, and it just wasn't a priority for Abby. Eventually, though, things changed, and they got engaged. But of course, because they were planning on living in the U.S., it wasn't just about the two of them.
We had this joke that, he got down on one knee and he said, "Abby, will you please put me on your health insurance?"
Oh, America. But anyway, they did it. Got married, had a couple of kids, and then Abby's job offered them an opportunity to move to Denmark. And in Denmark, just like Eben and Christian said, the pressure to structure your life one way wasn't there.
Nobody really cared or noticed or thought anything strange about the way we did things. Had we decided not to be married and have kids, nobody would have blinked an eye either. And, of the Danish or mixed friends that we have, most are married, but certainly not all are. And I know several couples who have kids who are not married, but they've been together for 10, 15, 20 years.
We've spent a lot of this episode talking about all of the structural and cultural factors that make life in Denmark happier. And Abby was experiencing all of it: the freedom of choice, the universal welfare state. She had also technically followed the success sequence: job, then marriage, then kids, in that order. All of the boxes were checked.
Denmark is a calm, safe place. It's clean, it's organized, and my God, it's so boring in its lack of chaos.
Abby wasn't happy.
I want to be the best that I can be. And I want my kids to be the best that they can be. And I want my colleagues and my friends to be the best that they can be. And sometimes that means being uncomfortable. Sometimes that means failing. Sometimes that means losing. Sometimes that means winning and gaining really big. But I think here, trying and encouraging somebody to be uncomfortable and to work through pain, it's not necessarily of value. And I find that, I find it lacking.
Abby's personal idea of happiness was different from the culture around her.
It makes me happy to try and fail, knowing that I really, really tried. And I think a lot of times, there's a happiness here. I don't know if happiness is the right word. There's less disappointment here. Mm-hmm. And so I would maybe replace happiness with less risk, less disappointment. The low is not as low.
Yeah. Less uncertainty, less precarity, all of these. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think maybe happiness is a misnomer. And I always encourage people to actually read what that scale is and how that happiness scale is defined. And just ask yourself, is that what happiness means to you? Is that what you want?
Exactly. Well, and that's one of the tricky things with all this kind of cross-cultural happiness research, right? Is it's all self-report, and our conceptions of what is happy are so culturally shaped. And so we're not necessarily even kind of talking the same language when we're reporting on a similar concept.
After years in Denmark, Abby still felt somewhat unsatisfied. And then her marriage was put under more and more strain. COVID happened. There was infidelity. And eventually, after nearly 2 decades together, she and her husband decided to divorce. And just like Eben said, it has been an easy process.
This is a small and efficient country, not big on chaos. So just like most other services, you can do it online. He will go online, fill out a form. I will get an official notification that something was requested of me, and I will press the button to accept that request, and then pretty much we'll be divorced.
Assets are typically split 50-50. Couples don't often need lawyers or to go to court. It's still a legal process, but it's treated as something that just happens. It's not something that the government tries to deter people from, because they trust them that it's the right thing sometimes. But of course, for all the saving graces of efficiency,
it's been long and hairy and messy and painful and very sad. But we both don't want to be sad anymore.
Simplicity doesn't ease the pain of a relationship that's ended. Social safety nets don't immunize against heartbreak. Divorce in Denmark is just as painful as it is in the US, but it is easier in a logistical sense. And in that way, Abby feels she's lucky. She has friends back in the US who can't afford to get divorced, can't pay for a lawyer, can't afford rent on an apartment, can't bear the idea of whispers and gossip. Friends who are unhappy, who are sad, who can't move on with their lives. And Abby, once she's healed a bit, she can.
I would like to see what else is out there in my life and, for my partner too. I absolutely believed in marriage. I loved being married. I loved the idea of being married, and I hope to be in a long-term relationship with someone again. So I'm definitely not anti-marriage in any way. But I definitely think that, God, it's really hard. And a lot of people are struggling. And I wish that people could feel a little bit more comfortable coming forward and saying, I'm struggling and I need help. And of course, yes, they can do that. They can go to a marriage counselor, but sorry, that's really expensive and difficult to do. And then you also, what if you admit to friends that you're having a hard time? So I want the conversation to be more out there about, sometimes it doesn't work. And hey, that's a bummer, but life isn't over. And then let's talk about what comes next and how to do it.
Abby's story helps us see how disconnected these debates over marriage promotion policies really are from people's lives. Even if marriage was the most important factor to people's happiness, which we now know that it's not, it tells you nothing about how any particular individual will experience their marriage. Relationships are complicated. Life can be messy. No matter how much we may want a formula or a mold, the bottom line is that no one size is ever going to fit all. But we might all be a little better off if we internalize that Danish way of thinking, that there are 37 or 137 ways to form a family. I know it can get tiring to see the Nordic countries held up as utopias. Clearly they're not. In fact, it was one of the reasons that we wanted to include Abby's perspective, to demonstrate the fact that just as there is no perfect family, there's no perfect country. We also have to consider that there are different understandings of happiness. That's why the concept of personal freedom is so important. Happiness means something different to each person. I mean, it's kind of a wild question to think about. Are you happy? As we were making this episode, I was reflecting a lot on how I would even answer that. Am I happy? It depends on the day. And it's unknowable if I would be more or less happy if my relationship and family life had played out in a different way. But here's one thing that I do know. I really wanted to be a mom. And the fact that I've been able to do that on my own terms has brought me a tremendous sense of joy and purpose and gratitude. I know that it makes me happy to see all the people who love my son, to see all of the people who he loves, Life may not be all rainbows and unicorns, but the community that I have built, it is quite honestly the most important thing. So what if that became our real focus? Next week on White Picket Fence.
Everything that is inside of us is longing for and trying to move toward each other.
White Picket Fence is a Wonder Media Network production. Our producers are Maddie Foley, Carmen Borca Carrillo, Abby Delk, and Lauren Williams. Our editor is Lindsay Cradwell. Executive producer is Jenny Kaplan. Original music by Sean Patel. Special thanks to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Shared Ascent Fund for their generous support for this season.